Hi there, welcome to Cloud Native Skunkworks Deep Dive on Komodor. Deep dives are where I like to look at products, processes, technology, and tooling and see how it can relate to DevOps and SRE concerns. Specifically, how can it make our lives easier? How can it help us to illustrate an issue or a service degradation throughout the organization in a better way? And so I thought Komodor was a really good match for these kind of interests, specifically when it's a really interesting space that hasn't had a lot of development, to see some folks come along and start to innovate there. So I'm going to take you through the tooling today, the platform, and some of the insights and the potential outcomes for the future that I see on this platform. Most of all, though, I want to sort of really drive home how exciting this is potentially for those folks in service support and L1. So without any further ado, let's have a quick look. Komodor is a Kate's native troubleshooting platform. They raised $25 million and they've been around about a year. It's been a pretty hockey stick growth for these folks. They're based out of Israel and they have a lot of all-stars backing them on the investor board, which is always a good sign that you have a product that's heavily funded and is believed in by the community. What's really interesting straight on the front page is this extremely easy to use and very visual heavy illustration and interpretation of what's going on inside your cluster. And I find this particularly appealing because a lot of folks don't want to dig into kube control, dig into how do I fetch a pod log through a secret, etc. And so here we've got a lot of these high-level remarks around what's happening with your workload health. In addition to this, you've got some customer testimonials here which effectively talk about Komodor in terms of simplicity, visibility. So this is a good sign to me. As I started to look through this earlier as well, one of the things that really stood out to me, again around this whole idea of personas, was that the on-call team and the higher level support teams should be part of this conversation of understanding what's going on with the health of your applications. And through tooling like this, you can bring on somebody from on-call support to say, hey, I think there's an issue here. We're seeing a red button or a red blob here. Shall we get someone from SRE to verify? So already you're looking and filtering on that initial set of services to make sure there is actually an issue at this layer. And Komodor, I think, really helps us to differentiate different problems going on within the cluster in a pretty simple way. So we'll jump into that in just a moment. And just to drive home this idea actually that they have written down here around end-to-end, if we scroll right down to integrations, I think a lot of us will immediately be drawn to the Prometheus integration, the Slack integration, and the ITSM integrations. Where you see Komodor positioning itself, well, I personally think that you're seeing it as either the start of the workflow or embedded in the middle of the workflow. So this could be once you've pushed from Git, then Komodor will alert downstream. It could also be passively monitoring on your cluster as well. So there is an opportunity to place it and to utilize its signals at either the start or continuously throughout your workflow. And we'll get into that, and that'll make, I think, a little bit more sense in a few moments. So the offering is effectively a hosted SaaS platform that integrates with your cluster deeply. This is really cool because we're using unified login. I can log in from my organization, and I'll just jump in here. Now, before I evaluate anything to do with the UX or any of these components here, what I want to do is to show you how you actually add an integration and how you get a cluster into Komodor. So let's jump into here. I'm going to add a Kubernetes cluster. This cluster I've actually just provisioned a moment ago. I'm just going to switch over to it, and it's called Proudwater. So I'm going to call that the same thing. Now from this cluster, we haven't got anything installed other than bare bones. But what's cool is that Komodor automatically generates a little snippet of Helm, and it gives you your API key. And that's one of those convenience things that makes a big difference when you're doing this several times. Also, what's interesting to me is you can script this, so this could be part of your deployment process. We could even wrap this inside a Terraform Helm release where we're interpolating the API key. So this can be part of that methodical deployment rollout. So that excites me a lot because those little details, again, going back to this idea of where we use this, those little details make a big difference. So now what's interesting here is you get this waiting for connection. So actually what's going to happen is it's not like a fire and forget kind of a deal. Komodor will actually wait for that incoming connection from your cluster to tell it that, hey, I'm registering here. And what you might also see in the top while we're waiting here is I've got a few other things that I've been playing around with. And that's interesting because the integrations, you can set the integration up once and you can use it for a bunch of different services. So, okay, the Helm chart's installed. I can see now that I've got the option to view my services on Explore. Rather than doing that straight away, what I will do is I want to go and have a look at what is the service that's been installed, because that again is important. If I'm having to run a 1,000 node cluster and it's installing a daemon set of 1,000 pods, that's noticeable. So I want to make sure it's not doing that. Of course it's not. It's installing a single pod in the Komodor namespace called Kate's Watcher. That Kate's Watcher pod has my API key as a secret, which is nice. It's not just injecting it straight into the YAML. Like, I like that we're following best practices here. And it's running this pod that has a YAML file mapped to it with all the configuration I would expect that's required to run this. So really nice stuff, really straightforward. I've worked with some of these things before where the integration has been a daemon set. I'm thinking of Datadog, I'm thinking of other systems that are fairly heavy, but because the Kate's Watcher is heavily predicated on the Kubernetes API, it doesn't need to have replicas running because that's not a service that is particularly taxing for it to poll from. So you can see what's interesting is just in the time of talking, my little Proudwater cluster has come up and it's starting to incrementally add services over time. I mean, admittedly, I don't really have much running here. So what we could try doing is deploying something and taking a look at that in a moment. Before we do though, I just want to take a look at the UX in the most basic sense. What's super interesting is that as a community, we are becoming more and more cognizant of this idea of folks running multiple clusters. That is especially true of myself, especially true of many people who work in SRE, and you're switching between staging, between testing and production environments. Having multi-clusters on here is really interesting, and as well, as I mentioned, having the integrations so that your different clusters can alert through Slack is super duper useful. So I just wanted to draw attention to that. And what's interesting as well is this panel on the left, the filtering panel, has been designed with the idea that you can crisscross and cut and paste these as different ways you want, right? So observability by daemon set across clusters, that's really nice as well. One of the things that's cool is that if we imagine we're doing a multi-cluster rollout, let's say I'm deploying Jaeger or Promtail to 3 different clusters, I can see right here if it fails on 2, but it passes on 1. And then I can look into that and why is that the case as well. And I'll get onto that in a moment, but I just want to go through the top level of the various panes in the application. So the Explore services is your first port of call. You can cut and paste between these different types of namespaces, health, kinds, etc. And the Watcher is providing continuously that information that's being updated. Secondarily to that, what you have is the events feed, and this is super interesting because this is actually something that I would almost want to get on a dashboard, right? Being able to see what's going on in the events history. This is really where I see the service folks coming and constantly monitoring. So if they are looking after a cluster, they can see the events that are happening on that cluster. And also the events that are happening on that cluster, right? They would correlate to an action. You would typically think, okay, well, the developers are pushing to this environment. Oh no, we can see that something's failed. We can correlate that to an action. And I'll come back to how GitHub links and deployment links can be used to create a paper trail between the activity in the cluster and what's in Komodor. You can see that here I have a couple of options in my clusters. I'm going to switch to CNS, and I'll just shift gear for a minute because I showed you a very simple cluster installation. Let's switch to a slightly larger cluster, and this is by no means enormous, but it has a bunch of observability tools on there that I care about. So let's have a look. So I've got some observability tools. I've even got Jaeger that's not running. It's not in a very healthy state. I don't know what's going on there. I just installed it a few minutes ago. We'll find out. So what you can see is that you have the Jaeger deployment, and you can see that Jaeger is also being marked as having some issues, and you can see that Cassandra was deployed with a failure as well. And you can see Cassandra's in a crash loop. So this is a really great screen because you can start to build up a forensic profile of what's going on. And what is interesting as well to me is that in incident management, this is great for timelining, and being able to eventually in the future do things like exporting this data will be invaluable because then I can start to build up this picture of what's going on in my cluster. I specifically like this. This is kind of a cool graph that you get built with your data points that come from the events across your clusters. That's really nice. So yeah, I think that this is something that visually it's a really big step in the right direction. And also just the convenience of being able to click through to the particular service that's failed is a really big thing. So I'm going to start to look at the next layer down, right? So we've looked at that top layer, we've looked at integrations, we've looked at services and events. What's next, right? What happens when a service does go bad? Well, let's click on this particular service, and you'll notice that I click through the events page to get there, but equally I can see it in my unhealthy services, and it's crisscrossing by cluster, and I can see it in CNS namespace, CNS cluster. I've got an unhealthy set of services, which reflects what I'm seeing here on the left side of my screen. So let's go and have a look what's going on here. So one thing that I didn't mention is that you have this nice ability to stack tabs, and this is great. It even works with you can even tab on it, and it's just really nice to be able to figure out what's going on, and also keep like a context of the things you're working on. So let's have a look just quickly here at Jaeger Cassandra. What I can see is a wealth of information, and actually almost like a sub-page of the events that are specific to my little service that I've just deployed. You can also filter by a bunch of this stuff, which is useful when you've had a bit of a longer run on this system, and I'll come to that a little bit later to give you some examples of a more mature cluster. But immediately what we see is this is unhealthy, 0 out of 3 replicas, it failed on the deployment, and all these related services are also unhealthy. And what we can see right away is they were all attempting to deploy at the same time. And that is so useful because we are starting to build up that analytical process of, okay, I think I can understand that these were all a related deployment. Obviously the name in this case gives it away, but I can see that it is part of the observability namespace. It's called Jaeger, and these things all were being deployed simultaneously. So let's figure out, what do we do from here? Well, that is where view pods and log status comes in. And this is really great because I don't have to jump into kube control. I mean, to do the same thing here, to look at this, I would firstly, well, let's just go out and do it. So I would have to go get pods. This is assuming that I have kube config. This is assuming that I know what I'm doing. I'd have to then say get Jaeger Cassandra 0. And then I would have to go logs. Like that. And this isn't scrollable particularly well. This also means that I have to run 3 different commands for events, logs, and describe. Whereas here, it's a single click, right? I'm getting it instantly with no problems whatsoever. I like this a lot because it is giving power to the support engineer. And this is stuff that I would have to end up running anyway. What's really interesting is this, like the event feed. You know, it's taking the Kubernetes event feed, but it's simplifying it in a matrix table. You can see that there are issues going on inside of this pod, and we can actually look at the previous logs as well. And you know, this is something that a support engineer can start to build confidence on. Like, okay, I'm figuring out what's going on. They can say, hey, these are the logs from the previous node. This was a crash. Maybe you want to check it out, SRE folks. And so, you know, we're really digging into the detail here. We're figuring out what's going on, and we're able to then surface that back up. Equally to that, what's super interesting is that you have this idea of annotations being emphasized throughout Komodor, right? Annotations are being emphasized at the services page, they're emphasized inside the service page, and they also are emphasized in the way that you provide data to Komodor. So one of the things that's interesting in particular to me is that in the documentation for Komodor, you can add deploy links. This is a URL that you can provide as an annotation on a cluster to give a specific piece of information, whether that's a URL, whether that is a release index or something else. Around GitHub integrations, there's a specific set of annotations that I'll come to a little later. But in terms of the deployment links, why I think this is powerful is because you can link this to a runbook. So if Cassandra is failing to deploy, what I could do from an SRE perspective is I could equip the support team, who are going to be the first folks that look at this, with an ability to succeed, right? I could say, okay, you know what? If there is a problem with Cassandra or with Jaeger, this is how you deal with it. This is how you fix it, and you can go to our runbook. So let's have a quick look at whether we can add one of these kind of annotations. So I believe that Cassandra is rolling out as a stateful set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit that stateful set, and looking at the docs here, this is an annotation. So you can see what's actually interesting as well is Komodor tries to resolve the service type by looking at the suffix on the link, which is really interesting. However, in my case, I'm going to just try my luck with Jaeger. So I'm going to add myself a little annotation. Oops, put that up here. And the deploy link is going to be .jaeger. And I'm just going to have perhaps the Jaeger operator or Jaeger Helm installation URL, just for illustrative purposes. I'm going to pop that in there, but oops, I'm going to pop it in there as a string, otherwise it will most likely complain. And this is really interesting as well because we're starting to codify knowledge, and I'm all about codifying knowledge. I care about that a lot. So let's go down to Jaeger. Let's get rid of these. I'm just going to double check to make sure that my my annotations are there. In fact, they'll be on the stateful set themselves. I'll also add an annotation to, let's have a look. What do we got? Jaeger query, I believe, is also a deployment. So I'm going to add an annotation to that as well. We can grab our deployment link, Jaeger, and we can put it in just here. Just for an example. Cool. So we've got those annotations added in to our cluster, and this is our cluster called CNS. Let's go back and see what we get out of that. So we've got Jaeger query. That was the one I just added. And what's interesting as well is that throughout this process, it's shifted the way that I'm thinking about things, in that I want to start providing Komodor with information rather than providing other services with information. What's interesting is that if you follow through with this, and as I mentioned earlier, you have the ability to add GitHub-based annotations as well, you can really create a very tight lockstep of when you do a deployment, you see an event change and correlate that all the way back to something in GitHub changing. There's a really interesting part. This was a first deployment for Jaeger, but there's a really interesting part of Komodor where you can look at the delta on a change of the YAML file. And I think that this is something that, as part of the support team, you just might say, hey, folks, this is the change. Could this be the bug? That is useful information because as an SRE, if I'm sitting in Slack and I'm, let's say, 10 minutes out from being able to get on my computer, and I see that suddenly one of the primary variables has disappeared, I'll be like, yeah, that's terrible. That shouldn't happen, right? So we're building that value in, and we're building the ability to debug things quicker. Now, I've not fully done this justice in that there are a bunch of different types of links. For the sake of my example, I added some custom links in that I can then see through the UI when it then picks them up. I mentioned a moment ago that you had this idea of adding in GitHub links and annotations. And I just want to circle back on that for just a moment. What's really interesting is that you can add an annotation that adds, like for example here, your specific SHA of your release. Let's take this for an example. So if I go to Jaeger query and I put this in as an annotation, and it appears I don't need it as a string after all. That might have just been me dreaming that this needed to be wrapped in quotations. And I put that in, obviously it's the wrong repo, etc., etc. Eventually when this gets picked up, this will link back to GitHub, to this particular repository at this SHA. And again, as I said a moment ago, that's super invaluable, super invaluable. On top of just these event types being based on deployment, health change, service degradation, Komodor is also working on a whole bunch of stuff around out of memory and other kind of key performance indicators for your cluster. This is where I wanted to, again, shift gear for the second time and take you into a larger scale cluster to look at a cluster that has a lot more namespaces, events, and just stuff going on. So let's look at this third cluster here, which I've been running for about 2 weeks, I would say. So let's go back in time. And I like this actually. This is a nice little widget. Let's go back in time and have a look and see where we are with that. And you can see that's kind of when I deployed. Woomph, more recently, a whole bunch of stuff got redeployed. And this is kind of interesting. Got too many restarts detected. That is definitely an issue that we saw inside of this particular service. I'm going to try and have a little look at what I get when I click on here. Again, we can see the service has been deployed. You can see 8 changes in the diff. That's great. And I can also see that this one goes to Komodor. So I've added a notification to this Slack channel. And what's really cool, if I show you, I will open up Slack, is that I have plumbed the alerting system in here for me on my private Slack. And now the Komodor platform is giving me direct alerts on service health status. And it's absolutely phenomenal that I can just click back through that and say, oh, okay, the service has become degraded. What's interesting as well is that because of the fan-out method of integrations, it's not an either-or situation. You can receive alerts directly from the event stream in Komodor and send them through to PagerDuty. It actually means in many ways, quite realistically, you don't need to have Prometheus running with Alert Manager, because Komodor will be picking up the event changes. Now, obviously you might want to have custom expressions in Prometheus still, and there's a whole bunch of reasons you will want that. But what I'm saying is that at an application level, if you're monitoring service status, it is not necessary to plumb with this particular workflow Prometheus into that glide path. So that's interesting to me, and it's specifically worth looking at. So we've looked at our problematic services that I deployed a few moments ago. You can see as well here there's a change to the annotation. Do you remember that I just put in that change that showed you the annotation diff here? That's kind of nice. You can see that, hey, this is this thing showing up here. And also, do you remember I put in that link to Jaeger? So again, Jaeger is now showing up, and I can click on the runbook. Just imagine how cool that would be if it said like emergency runbook. Hit this if the service doesn't deploy. So for me, this is a really, I would say, accessible and quite intuitive way of navigating around. I mean, I've played with this for maybe 25 minutes tops, and I found it very intuitive, understanding where I need to get to. Maybe somebody who isn't so familiar with the area can find their way around this in a little bit longer, but overall, it's been really, really positive in terms of just getting up and running. One of the final things I want to demonstrate today is the fact that Komodor are moving towards a new system of workflows where, going beyond the basics of an event in the cluster, it'll now start to guide your solutioning and potentially help you figure out where to debug. So to illustrate that, I have a simple example on the left. These are a bunch of pods that after 60 seconds or so will crash out of memory. On the right, within my CNS cluster, I have this memory demo, and you can see that instantly I have a new field in the details illustrating that this is an out of memory kill. But what's interesting is this new analysis button. This is the start of this new intuitive workflow where Komodor recommends what to do in these particular situations. And what's specifically interesting here is this is almost a checklist, especially for those folks in first line support, where it says, hey, do you want to try doing something such as looking at the pods by, here it says by selector, check if they're running. It also says here, do you want to try rolling back to a previous configuration? And what's exciting to me about this is that in conjunction with some of the other features that are coming out soon, such as node status and additional workflows, we're really seeing this crystallize that idea that this is becoming the platform for troubleshooting, especially for those folks who may not want to dig into Kubernetes itself. So we've talked about what does Komodor bring to the table. It is bringing to the table effectively a new kind of onus on this single pane of glass, not for observability, but for troubleshooting, diagnostics, and second order problem finding inside of clusters. And for me, this is exciting because it's really emphasizing something that I've always thought, and that having to use tooling in the command line isn't for everybody, right? Like that's something that an SRE might feel comfortable with, but if you are working on Windows and you're a support engineer and you're working on a browser only, then it's going to become more inaccessible. You might have to start installing things. You might start finding yourself into a domain that you're not so comfortable with. Sure, you can do it. I'm not saying you can't do it, but how much of a delta is there between you being productive and actually identifying the issue and routing it to the right person, right? It could be something as simple as, oh, well, there's 6 out of 8 pods have deployed. This is saying that the health has changed. Is that a problem? And messaging someone, they can say, yeah, I've seen what Comodore's saying. Actually, that's a deeper rooted problem. Or no, that's fine. We'll sort that out in the next release. You are starting the conversation earlier. It's not somebody being, hey, this is a thing. I don't know what's going on. And instantly hitting that panic button of, okay, this is an SRE problem. I only deal with first line support. And that is a typical paradigm you see. And the amount of hours that have been wasted in that back and forth, and also the idea of the support engineers not feeling like they have any sorts of agency or autonomy and are simply fielding intercom tickets. So again, it's extremely powerful that somebody could just come into this and say, okay, well, I can see that there are 3 different containers. I'm going to look through each one. I can see that the sidecar's fine for Jaeger. I can see that this other container, the init container is fine, but I can see that the query container is not running, and maybe somebody from SRE can help me. And again, it's just about copy pasting this. And a very small UX thing that I love is, again, being able to copy logs. It's so useful, right? Copying logs, copying events. You can see there's a transport error. That probably means there's something going on behind the querier. So how would I summarize where I see Komodor going and what I like about it? I think that effectively the things that are exciting to me are that the platform is mature at the point to be useful for many teams in many different circumstances. And what excites me is that as more integrations come out and more event types come out, we can start to see even more fine-grained controls. So yeah, this has been a really interesting deep dive. I've been really, really excited to actually get a chance to play around with it. I'm going to leave it running for a couple of months just so I can start to capture loads of events. And as new product features come out, I'm going to really leverage those to figure out how I can build a workflow through the UX. What I think also would be super interesting is that because Komodor supports multiple users as well, how does this work with a team, right? How does a team work together in a single pane of glass? And what are some of the friction points? What are the things that work well? I would love to actually have Komodor open on one side of the screen with myself, support engineer, maybe someone from an L2 as we're diagnosing an issue, and we can almost like keep a note and a ledger of like what's going on, like saying, okay, well, we've seen the delta of this service, we've seen that this is going on. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how it fits into that production incident management scenario. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive. It's been a real pleasure to make it. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. Please do like and subscribe. I make these videos out of a pure love for the industry, and I hope that they're useful to juniors and to seniors alike. If there's anything in particular that I can answer about Komodor, I'd be happy to put you in touch with them, or I'm sure they would be happy to reach out to you. But again, thank you so much, and goodbye.